toxicology. Another aspect about me is I'm an avid outdoorsman. I have a ranch in Kent County where I've done a lot of my research related to this whole quail issue, which you hear about today. And I've been fortunate to have a family that loved the outdoors with me, and we have 5 Llewellyn setter bird dogs that we hunt quail with, and so on. So I'm still a quail hunter, but I don't shoot many of them anymore because they kind of became my buddies after 10 years of working on this FDA registration. So I just wanted people to know that I'm not just some professor working in a classroom and going to a lab once in a while. I'm an avid outdoorsman, and I love my work, and this has been a very important project to me. So today, we'll be talking about the development of quail guard and why we even needed to develop it, and what does it mean? What are we seeing related to the scientific discovery? Okay. What's that?
Click on the PowerPoint itself.
Right here?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, real briefly, the northern bobwhite is a very economically important game bird and a significant contributor to the U.S. economy. In fact, some of my friends that are in commercial real estate for ranches and so on, they say if you've got a good wild quail population on your ranch, just like having an oil well. Hunting leases generate multiple times more than income from cattle leases if you've got quail. So it's highly economically relevant to the state of Texas, particularly. And what I've come to learn, particularly in the rolling plains as well as South Texas, people come not just from across the country to hunt wild quail here. They come from all over the world, and I had no idea that it was that important. Quail are an umbrella species. What does that mean? Their habitat supports many other species, including grassland birds, that are under great pressure today in diminishing populations, and the quail is not immune to that. Their populations have generally diminished dramatically from when I was a kid in South Carolina and had quail all around my home outside of Florence, South Carolina. So I was very lucky as a kid to have that resource, which is basically gone now. And so we look at bobwhite as culturally important to the state of Texas and to the state of South Carolina. So again, as we were looking at all of this, it's relevant to why we would even want to study quail and preserve them as an ecologically important wildlife species. Since the last number of decades, quail have been diminishing across their home range. Essentially, quail through the southeast all the way to Texas, up into Kansas, Missouri, and so on, was a highly sought after game bird from the 60s on. And the decline started, particularly as we looked into the 70s and moving forward. The decline has been fairly dramatic, such that most of the wild quail hunting left in the United States has been replaced with introduction of pen-reared birds. That's basically a put-and-take situation. It's Texas that's remained a stronghold. And of course, the rolling plains has been important to me because I live in the rolling plains. I have a ranch in the rolling plains, and it gets real personal when you love your quail and you see them, and all of a sudden you don't see them. And so we're going to talk about that. And even in spite of relatively stable habitat in the rolling plains, I've had my property for right at 27 years. And, when we look across the rolling plains, driving out there, the habitats remain relatively the same, pretty close. Of course, rainfall varies and so on, but we can still have dramatic population shifts with our wild quail. And I'm going to talk about that because what we're going to challenge is it just habitat and rainfall driving these populations, or could it be other variables that may be contributing? And it's going to be an interesting question for us to consider. when we look back in time, in terms of quail populations, the Texas Parks and Wildlife does roadside surveys of quail, and they do it in Oklahoma too with the Oklahoma Fish and Game Department. But this gives us, through certain routes, some evidence of population increases and decreases. What I find interesting is every time we get an increase, we get a dramatic decrease. This was particularly relevant in 2016 when we had a tremendous population of wild quail in the rolling plains, and as we looked into 2017, we started to see dramatic declines to the point where in 2018, we were seeing some of the lowest quail populations ever seen in the rolling plains. So, and this carried on for a number of years afterwards. So, when we look back to 2010, we were at that time actually anticipating a very good quail year. And I was very excited because in July approximately of that year, there were so many broods on our ranch. You had to be careful driving around. You didn't want to run over a brood. But by October, November of that year, you could hardly find a quail. This occurred in 2010, and it precipitated a large-scale research project implemented by multiple universities and funded by sportsmen's organizations. And I can't say enough for Park Cities Quail Coalition, the Rolling Plains Quail Research Foundation, among others, that said, hey, something's going on that looks to be above habitat, because we essentially had perfect habitat in 2010, as I did on my ranch. We had sunflowers, plenty of ragweed, broomweed, so on. I mean, it was a smorgasbord for quail. But all of a sudden, our quail were gone when it came that fall. And so people reached out to me from everywhere in the Rolling Plains saying, what happened? And this did precipitate a large-scale, multi-year research project that looked at about everything that could be an underpinning of causing quail impact. And we looked at, with cooperation with multiple universities across the state and even into Oklahoma, we looked at bacteria, viruses, pesticides, heavy metals, and so on. But it was the parasite hypothesis that seemed to emerge to the top as far as the prevalence of it, the intensity of it, and so on. And again, I had no axe to grind with this. I'm an environmental toxicologist, began my career in 1980, have worked all over the world and looking at toxicology. So I never dreamed I'd get into parasitology as much as I have. And I guess I'm kind of a parasitologist now because we've just published our 50th paper related to parasitic infection in wild quail and so on. So we've been intensively following the science of this, particularly from approximately 2012. And I'll get more into that as I get deeper into the talk. We've been particularly interested in two worms that have shown up in our wild quail, particularly in the rolling plains. It's the eye worm, Oxyspirua petraui, and the cecal worm, Alanocephalus pinula. Now, Oxyspirua petraui, people say, well, what the heck is that? Well, it's a worm that inhabits the eye of the wild quail, and it's more than 90% related to the African eyeworm infecting humans called Loa loa. And this worm in humans can cause blindness and literally penetrate the brain. So that's basically what's in the eye of a wild quail. And Alanocephalus pinula, Alanocephalus is a cecal worm. It lives in the intestines of the quail, specifically in the cecum. People say, well, what the heck is Alanocephalus? Well, it's 92% related to the roundworm in your dog, believe it or not. It's essentially equivalent to an ascarid. So, in essence, with my bird dogs, I deworm on a monthly schedule. If you don't deworm your bird dogs, Alonocephalus or ascarids will diminish their energy, will cause hair loss, will cause weight loss, and it will ultimately kill them if they are untreated for a period of time. So essentially, this, in addition to the eyeworm, is what is being carried around by our wild quail. And I'm going to show you how intensive these infections can occur. Well, have other game birds in the world been influenced by parasites? You better believe they have. The famous red grouse of Scotland, which is heralded as one of the premier sport shooting opportunities in the world, suffered dramatically from a cecal worm. And believe it or not, that cecal worm in the infections influenced their populations such that when intensive infection occurred, we started to lose birds from the population and they couldn't hunt them. And so, in essence, there were two things it did to the grouse. Number one, it reduced their energy, so their flight pattern and flight intensity was reduced just enough for the harriers to catch them, the hawks. And secondly, it caused the female setting the eggs to elicit a specific odor that the foxes keyed in on. And so, in essence, nests were being destroyed at a dramatic rate with these infections occurring. And so, again, the Scots looked at strategies to look at this, and they actually came up with a drug treatment that built on the ecology of the red grouse. The red grouse lives in the moors of Scotland. They're eating a lot of fiber, so they have to eat grit every day. And so the Scots learned that the red grouse would come to a grit pile and they could actually get a drug into that grit pile and influence the level of intensity of these cecal worms. So we actually collaborated and interacted, and I gave a talk with the Scottish scientists at the Dallas Safari Club years ago when we were in the early stages of our work here in the United States. So anyway, this is not something that may be happening in Texas. It's happened elsewhere in the world. And so we believe, and that set a foundation, it could be highly relevant. We spent years trying to figure out the life cycle of the eyeworm, particularly because what we learned, and I worked particularly in Mitchell County, Texas, in the early stages. We published our first paper in Wildlife Diseases, finally reporting the intensity of infection and how fast it can occur. And I work in Mitchell County back in 2013, 2014. Nevertheless, the quail becomes infected. The worms grow to maturity in the eye of the quail. They actually mate in the eye, produce eggs, which are swallowed through excretion from the eye into the esophagus. It passes into the intestines of the quail. It then is released into the environment in quail droppings. Certain species of insects come along and eat those droppings. And what we've learned is that those species then will have the eggs hatch in their bodies, and the worms will grow to the first important stages, and it's called the L3 infective larva. And so this takes, 50 plus days to generate, but in essence, the quail then comes along and eats these bugs. And what we've learned, it may not be just one eyeworm, L3 infective larvae, and one bug. It could be dozens. Okay, so in essence, a quail may eat one grasshopper and be exposed to literally dozens of eyeworms ultimately. Because believe it or not, when the quail eats, say, the infected cricket, the cricket goes into the crop of the quail, part of the digestive tract. And in essence, the L3 larvae is able to bore out of the cricket into the esophagus. It migrates up the esophagus into the nasal sinuses and on into the eye in about 10 minutes, believe it or not. So this really fascinated us because in the early stages of this, we were looking at plausibility for rapid infection and intensity of infection such that we might have pathological consequences either at the individual or at the population level. Um, Parasitic infection, as we began in the early stages of this, um, we learned that many of our wild bob white are infected with either relatively low levels of cecal worms or eye worms or both. And what we've come to find out, it's almost impossible to find a wild bob white in the rolling plains without the eye worm and the cecal worm if it has not eaten the medicated feed. In other words, with the medicated feed, we actually can get a 100% eye worm and cecal worm free bird. Nevertheless, in our early work in 2011 through 2013, we were first to define how rapidly and widespread the epidemiology of these infection events could occur. And that really got my attention as to plausibility of large scale impact if a more regional infection level can occur versus just a ranch or a given area. It became particularly interesting to us that in the spring of 2016, we had one of the largest quail populations we've had in many years in the rolling plains. And so what we found is that a lot of the birds were infected, and the infection intensified on into 2017. So what we think is that the more definitive host you have, the quail, the more potential for spread of parasitic disease. And such that by the spring of 2017, we were averaging about 14 eye worms and 290 cecal worms per quail. Those are high infections. And by 2018, this had even increased even more. And I want to say that if you look at this graph, these are the roadside counts, just a general perspective. But it showed in 2016 we had a lot of quail, but by 17 they had dropped off dramatically, and by 18 you could hardly find a wild quail in the rolling plains, except where we treated with medicated feed. Now, this became particularly relevant to us because in Mitchell County, we had established a transect. We called it Nick's Transect because of my first PhD student on this project, Nick Dunham. And it was a 6-mile long transect that we followed for 10 years and trapped on a monthly basis. And so when we saw this increase in quail population on Nick's transect, we might could catch 30 quail in a day there. We trap it about a week on a monthly basis. And we might catch 30, 40 quail. And all of a sudden, when we started seeing the decline, and by February of 2017, we picked up intense infection and the quail were starting to drop off. And I actually collected some birds from from this particular area, quail, that is, and they were light as a feather and they were so emaciated and they were loaded with particularly cecal worms. But my point is, on Nick's transect, as we went from 17 to 18, the quail were so wiped out that one of my students, Matt, spent a week on that transect intensively tracking, And by 2018, he didn't catch one bird in a week. He didn't hear one bird. He didn't see one track. The quail were gone. And we, at the same time, were able to demonstrate these intense infections where this data I'm showing you right here. All of this I'm talking about, you can go, you'll see at the end of my talk. You can go to my website. This is all published, peer-reviewed science. So we've taken a lot of interest in scientifically documenting this and not just talking about it. So as I continue on here, um, people say, well, what does cecal worms do? Well, what we have found that generally there's a lack of digesta in heavily infected quail, and we see significant reductions in fat stores. And if you're a quail hunter like me, when I shoot a quail, I like to see what they're eating. I like to see what their fat stores are because they need some backup fat stores in case they hit an ice storm, rough weather, or whatever. So again, impairment of the cecal may affect immune function, nutrient absorption, and water absorption. Um, in fact, we've seen, as you'll see on this slide, on the top right, this much infection in one bird. Remember, the cecal worm is essentially an ascarid worm in your dog. That's essentially what it is. It has a sophisticated developed mouth part here. It can attach. It can attach to tissue. And it's an egg producing machine. 2/3 of the organism of the female is egg production. And their strategy is to produce as many eggs to release from the fecal material of the quail to continue the infection cycle. Why this particular bird? This is a normal quail. If you shot a quail and open up its breast, that's a fully developed pectoral muscle, and that bird can probably fly really fast. This bird is emaciated. It was infected with cecal worms. And believe it or not, we were contacted by a ranch in Mitchell County, and dogs were pointing quail and catching them. And the bird dogs were able to catch the quail. And so they provided us samples, and they were absolutely loaded with cecal worms. And we said, wow, I mean, if a bird dog can catch a quail, imagine what a hawk can do. And this was anecdotal, but these hunters were so into it, they were reporting quail feather piles, indication of predation, all over the place. And they said the quail were basically gone. And so these were the early signals that predation could play a very important role in this as we continue to peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak. And so I'm going to get to this concept of a weight of the evidence approach because this isn't a project that you just go do one big field study and everybody agrees on the statistics and you come out with a conclusion and that's it. It doesn't work that way. It's a process of the weight of the evidence. And I learned that by being chairman of the EPA Science Advisory Panel and having to work on very complex scientific issues on environmental contamination and disease issues. And we just don't have a straight line from A to Z. You have to navigate through the science and putting together a weight of the evidence approach. The weight of the evidence approach, as we generally look at this, we have a paper we produced and published in the International Journal of Parasitology, Parasites and Wildlife. But, what is the weight of the evidence right now? Well, our lab evidence supports the field evidence, what we predicted in pathology and infection. We've seen evidence of erratic behavior in infected quail. In fact, I'm going to get to some points where we've had landowners we've worked with as FDA demonstration ranches that used to wear me out saying that they had more quail in the freezer that flew into the wind and killed themselves or flew into their doors or their barns. And they never see that anymore since they started using Quail Guard. Eyeworms are widespread in the rolling plains. Um, we don't know why, but we know they are widespread and it extends up into Oklahoma. The cecal worm is widespread too, even into South Texas. People ask me, are you more concerned about the eyeworm and the cecal worm? I'm concerned about both. They both do damage when we're looking at the ecological health of a wild quail trying to survive. Parasitic infection is also a cumulative process. We have a paper in the Journal of Helminthology that demonstrates how 96% of the quail will have dropped out of the population if they've got more than 300 cecal worms. That's an example. So it is a cumulative process. It's just like your dog. How many roundworms can your dog tolerate if you don't treat him? Well, it's going to vary per dog. But ultimately, if you don't treat that dog, my prediction will be the ascarids will probably kill him. We now know that arthropod explosions facilitate infection, and these explosions can occur with certain climatic events. And we particularly thank Park Cities Quail Coalition for funding our mobile research laboratory that has allowed us to deploy all over the rolling plains looking for the parameters that set the foundation for large-scale epidemiological events. And they happen, and they can happen fast, and they can happen very intensively. In other words, we demonstrated years ago, you can go from a relatively low infection quail population in just a couple of months, you may be 90 to 100% intensely infected. So it's not like years. This happens in months, even down to weeks in cases. Time frames, generally what we see is a ramp up of infections in the summer as we tail into the fall. And for those birds that don't drop out of the population, they set the foundation for next year's infection. So again, this continues to rotate through the quail population. It accelerates under certain environmental conditions, and we now have learned we can break the cycle with quail guard. I'll explain that more. We've learned that cecal worms devastated red grouse in Scotland, and the parasite control allowed sustainable red grouse populations. What we've seen, the medicated feed is helping us sustain quail populations. I have data to support that. With predator pressure exploding, quail have never needed a little bit more help just to survive. Anything that suppresses their energy makes them a little less visually acute or fly a little less fast. That sets the stage for the predation parameter. After about 10 years of work, FDA approved Quail Guard in May of 2024. The recommendation is that we treat 21 days in the spring and 21 days in the fall. It's not a vaccine. It's a medicated feed containing the active drug ingredient fenbendazole. It's extremely safe to the quail. It's safe for a chick to eat it all the way up to adult. In fact, it's actually used as an anthelmintic in humans, and the Argentinians are using it as an anti-cancer drug. So it has robust impacts as far as health outcomes and warm-blooded vertebrates. Nevertheless, we spent about 10 years working on the formulation of the medicated feed, and my son, Ronnie Kendall, has developed a quail delivery system called Quail Safe that protects the feed, that allows the quail to come in to feed safely. And we now know we can treat a wild quail at the landscape level. Recent studies treating bobwhites for parasites. Here you can see an eyeworm on the surface of the eye, but it's not there that we're worried about them mainly. It's behind the eye, in the compartments of the eye, particularly the Hardarian gland. In medicated feed versus no feed, we set up a major project on a large ranch in Mitchell County. And this was starting to set the stage. We had to do efficacy testing for the FDA to prove how efficient these quail guard was at removing parasites. So he went through, we had 3 6-mile transects separated by 2 miles apiece. So there aren't many ranches that can do that. We were on one that was that big on the same ranch. And on one of the transects, we did nothing, left it natural. Another one of the transects, we introduced just fortified feed, not the medication in the treatment systems. And on the third transect, we introduced the medicated feed. And we started in 2015, and we even saw a bump with the medicated feed in 2015. But after 2 years of treatment, we saw an explosion of medicated feed transect. And that really got our attention because we were not only looking for health outcomes, were we able to get rid of the parasites, but we said, wow, I mean, this was unexplainable. It's on the same ranch. We had a 300% increase when we medicated those birds. So, and we had evidence. The birds weren't flip-flopping between transects. They were very located on those 6-mile transects, and we had telemetry data to prove that. So anyway, this was some of the early stages that we were starting to say, wow, not only can we reduce parasite loads, if not eliminate them, we can enhance quail populations. We did another project in Oklahoma. And from the day we walked on that property, one of our treatment sites, to where we are today, we've had a 536% increase in covey call counts. Covey call counts are when you go out at daylight and you listen around you and you're listening for the covey call. And what I can tell you is anytime you can get above 10 covey calls around you in a given morning in a given site, you got a good many quail. And so anyway, what we've seen on this site is an increase in our wild quail. And what my PhD student Jeremiah Leach found, we were increasing survivability by 40%. And when you can amortize that over 4 or 5 years, that showed us why we had so many more quail compared to a reference site. What I really want to say here is not only did we get the population up where the property owners, this was an FDA demonstration site, it was approved. The property owners were saying that the quail hunting was excellent and it was sustained even through the droughts. And so what we think now is that we are definitely able to sustain huntable populations. And we have not just demonstrated this on one site, we've demonstrated it on 5 sites now. We're looking for the repeatable data that shows us, can we sustain huntable populations? The answer to that is yes.
You move up to.
Okay. What we're also showing to move along quickly, we are able to significantly reduce eyeworm infection in our treatment birds, as well as reduce cecal worm infection. And we've been able to show this. This is all published. You can go to my papers. But we actually see with the quail guard treatment, we actually can see parasite-free birds. And that's almost impossible to find in the rolling plains as I sit here today and discuss this with you, unless they fed on quail guard. We've also seen the reduction in intermediate host infection over time. And that doesn't happen in just a year or so. What we have seen when we treat year after year, we are dramatically reducing the percent of intermediate hosts that are infected with the infective larva of the eyeworm and the cecal worm. This is very important because we are now demonstrating that with repeated treatment, we only treating 21 days, you're not going to get resistance when you only treat 21 days in the spring and the fall. But we can break the cycle and we can reduce those levels of infection to sustainable levels as demonstrated by the quail populations themselves. I really wanted to show this data. Bear with me. Um, Texas Parks and Wildlife, over a number of years, the red histogram here, they are showing roadside counts. This is a barometer of a given area, a distance on a road, how many quail you see. And as I mentioned to you in 2016, we had a tremendous quail population in the rolling plains that dropped off dramatically by 18. The Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch, they do covey call counts every year. And so you can see their data and covey call counts actually mirrors Texas Parks and Wildlife roadside counts. So it gives us some background of covey call counts versus roadside counts and whatever. If you look here at the orange histogram, this is a FDA demonstration snipe, Snipes Ranch in Stonewall County. We were treating there with Quail Guard, and you can see he sustained huntable quail populations when the numbers of quail reported by Texas Parks and Wildlife on their roadside counts had reached the lowest level in recorded history. And so while Snipes was hunting quail, his neighbors weren't. That's kind of the acid test to me. He was treating. And so again, these are all the pieces of the weight of the evidence as we bring all of this information together. But this demonstrates it's not just habitat and rainfall driving these populations. We were able to sustain huntable populations on a treatment site even through drought. And while Texas Parks and Wildlife reported roadside counts at an all-time low. On the ground evidence. These are some quotes from cooperators. But in the first 23 hours of hunting at Snipes Ranch, Joe Crafton, who keeps up with every covey point, reported 113 covey finds in 23 hours. David Williams at W7 Ranch in 2017 had quit hunting quail. He couldn't find this in Garza County. We began treating in approximately 2018. In the last few years, you can see his quote. He expects to push 15 to 20 coveys on 2 2-hour hunts a day. And he is ecstatic because we have sustained good quality quail hunting for him over the last 3 years at least. And he's real excited about it. Brad and Melissa Ribelin on the Ribelin Ranch, they will stand up and tell the world. After they started using Quail Guard, they live on their ranch. They love their quail. And they were consistently calling me to come get quail that had flown into their house, killed themselves, their barns, and whatever. When we began treating, this just like never happens anymore. And I mean, they are astounded. And their population, their quail population, why I'm excited is that I went out there on the last day of the season last year. Ronnie and I went out. We found covey roosts bigger than a baseball hat. That's another thing we're seeing on all 5 of our FDA demonstration ranches. Very large covey roosts, and a lot of them on the last day of the season. In other words, Rick Snipes will tell you, we're not whittling down the quail to about a dozen in a covey. They're seeing, Rick actually was on video recently, 25 to 35 birds near the end of the season in a covey. And so this on Ribelin Ranch, and I've hunted quail since I was a little boy. We had several covey finds on the last day of the season last year, If there weren't 30 in the covey rise, I don't know what was. And so again, we were seeing 20, 25 bird coveys up to 30 birds in a covey and the covey roost. I mean, this was not just one. I saw them all over the ranch. And so again, my point is, there's something to this. If we can sustain those quail through that winter period to get those birds into a older bird that's able to breed, they are more successful breeders as 2 and 3 year olds. Um, we've learned that treatment with Quail Guard and Quail Safe, here are both scale quail and bobwhites feeding in Quail Safe. They accept the feed readily. They can be attracted to Quail Safe. They go in it very easily. And once the bird's located, it's very easy to treat them. And we can suppress, if not eliminate, infection. Again, Quail Guard is not a vaccine, it's a treatment. So reinfection can occur, but you manage that by treating in the spring. We usually treat in March and get fantastic effects from reducing parasites. And then we treat in the fall. So in other words, these are some of the mechanisms we're using now. And we're finding, depending on the habitat, about one quail safe per 100 to 300 acres seems to be effective. We're still working on that. Nevertheless, we have an electronic call with Quail Safe, the covey call, and you won't believe how far it can, hundreds of yards it can pull these birds in to feed on the medicated feed. Current investigations are continuing. We're continuing to work out these epidemiological events and what triggers them, particularly in the rolling plains. But we're also working in Oklahoma, and we may be working in various other places in the near future. We're having discussions. We're looking at parasite impacts on reproduction now. We know we've infected survivability. One of our studies clearly documents a 40% increase in survivability and more 2 and 3 year olds of quail in the population. So we're sustaining older birds that make our best breeders. Nevertheless, with some of the studies currently underway with radiotelemetry and other techniques, we're looking at the reproduction issue. We're also looking at the epidemiology between song. We have found this in certain songbirds now, and we're very concerned about it because migratory songbirds can actually bring this into quail habitat. And so we're working on that now with various techniques to look at the songbird infection versus the quail infection. People have asked us extensively, how many birds in the population do you have to treat to sustain a huntable population? We're on our way to figuring that out. We're using passive integrated transponder tags to insert into the quail, and we have technology that can read these data by going into quail safes to feed, and we're starting to work on it. We're not quite there yet. We're working on it, but we're getting a very good feeling. And the question is, you don't have to feed or treat 100% of your quail. You don't need to sustain them. We're learning that number may be less than 50%, more than 20%, at least a third we're thinking, but we're figuring that out. And we will have the science to prove this in this coming year. I wanted to thank our sponsors. Park Cities Quail Coalition has been a giant in sponsoring our work, and we appreciate that and all of the hard work they've done to help us advance new strategies to help our quail. This is what this is all about. It's not about anything else, but just try to help them, try to sustain huntable populations, because when we have quail hunters, we have quail conservation dollars. The Rolling Plains Quail Research Foundation have been terrific over the years. I thank them. Mewburn Foundation have been phenomenal in helping us and continuing that support as we've looked into a lot of questions with them. Snipes Ranch, Ryblin Ranch, W7, all of these people have helped our graduate students and being able to implement very intensive field studies, long-term field studies that have gone on for years. The Food and Drug Administration, they stuck with me for 10 years. It takes a new drug registration, it takes an average of 10 to 15 years for a drug company. We did it in a little over 9 years. I'm kind of proud of that because we did it with my graduate students. And so with oversight from FDA, and I thank them for it. But again, Quail Guard represents the first medicated feed drug article to be approved by the FDA for use on a wildlife species in the natural habitat that would become commercially available. It made U.S. history. And it was possible by all of these supporters that helped us, including Texas Tech University, where I'm a professor. So again, I thank all of these people. And as I mentioned early in my talk, and Megan asked me to give 10 minutes for questions and answers, I'm going to be right on the money for you, Megan. But I would like to say, if you'll see my website down here at the bottom, all I've said today is documented in the scientific literature, and we're proud of that because we subjected our science to peer review. We built on the building blocks of science. I'm proud of my graduate students and our team that's worked together for many, many years to develop where we are today. I thank you for your attention. Megan, I thank you for the opportunity for me to give this talk, and it's exactly 10 minutes to 1 on my clock.
I appreciate it, Dr. Kendall. If anybody listening has any questions, if you don't have your chat pulled up, you're more than welcome to drop questions in the chat. It's a little easier to filter versus everybody unmuting and trying to ask. So if you do have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and we'll see it on our end, and Dr. Kendall would be happy to answer it. And Dr. Kendall, do you have a email address and or other contact that you'd like to drop there for
Yes.
anybody who may be willing to or in need of reaching out to you?
Yes. My email is ron.kendall, Kendall, @ttu.edu.
Okay. I'm putting that in the chat for anybody interested. I don't see anybody popping up with questions, which means that you must have done a really, really good and thorough job today.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity here.
Yes, sir. We appreciate you being here. And again, everyone in attendance, Dr. Kendall's email address is in the chat for anybody interested. Also, before we turn everyone loose, I'd like to quickly plug our next Wild at Work webinar, which is coming up in July, specifically on July 23rd at noon. And we'll have Joey Park, who is our TWA Legislative Program Coordinator, coming to do a recap of the 89th legislative session for us. We appreciate everybody being here today. Thank you guys for joining us and spending your lunch hour. Thank you again, Dr. Kendall, for taking an hour out of your day to spend with us. We greatly appreciate it. And if there are no questions, which I'm not seeing any popping up, then we'll turn everybody loose. Thank you guys for joining us today for Wild at Work.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Oh, hold on. Looks like we have, oh no, don't have any questions. That's just a thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.